Together, Coming Apart, Episode 21, Follow the Yalu Brick Road. When we left our mighty soldiers last week, the UN forces had just captured Pyongyang on October 19th and established a line across the neck of the peninsula to Wonsan on the east coast. From this line, the plan was for UN forces to advance to a point no closer to the Manchurian border than 55 miles. That line was known as the MacArthur Line, and from there, South Korean soldiers would continue advancing to the border. Non-Korean forces were to be held back away from the border in an attempt to keep that scariest of boogeymen at bay: intervention by the Chinese Communists. On October 19th, the Chinese Communists intervened in the Korean War. This was not a decision taken lightly in Beijing. In fact, it was the result of months of debate and deliberation between decision-makers in Beijing and Moscow. As historian Chen Jian writes in his book China's Road to the Korean War did not immediately present the Chinese with a crisis. That occurred 2 days after the war began, when the United States entered the war on the side of South Korea. That action of taking what could have been a sort of civil war and making it an international war, even though it will stay contained to the Korean Peninsula, presented communist leaders in Beijing with a crisis of national and international scale. That the United States paired its entrance into the war with its intervention in the Taiwan Straits amplified the feeling of crisis in Beijing. Although publicly, Truman placed U.S. naval forces between Taiwan and mainland China to act as a neutral barrier, it is understandable that the Communists perceived this as the United States protecting Chinese Republicans from a communist attack and placing the United States in direct opposition to the People's Republic. This was not a shock to the Chinese, it just confirmed what they already thought about the treachery of the American imperialists and their feelings towards their revolutionary ideals. Truman's action made Chinese intervention much more likely, but it was not the last straw. That would come 4 months later. This crisis presented the Chinese a new opportunity, one that was expected but heretofore unknown. Chen points out that this is framed by the Chinese word for crisis, weiji, which can be split into wei and ji, danger and opportunity. Within the danger of American intervention, Mao believed he could find the opportunity to carve a place for his new country in the world. There were 2 other places in East Asia besides Korea where that opportunity may have come: Indochina and Taiwan. Naturally, Mao preferred Taiwan because he could kill 2 birds with 1 stone if he knocked out the Chinese Republicans. Indochina was also an option because the Indo-Chinese Communists were 5 years into an independence fight against the French colonizers. The American intervention in Korea came at just the right time, though, to edge out any Chinese intervention into Indochina or Taiwan. Thus, Korea was on the path to becoming the first proper battleground for the young People's Republic. Once the North Korean invasion began, the focus of the world's policymakers snapped to Korea. That's true in Washington, that's true in Moscow, and it was especially true in Beijing. With conflict in Korea and the U.S. 7th Fleet in the Taiwan Straits, any Chinese plans to invade Taiwan were promptly dropped, and the military and diplomatic apparatuses of China pivoted towards its smaller neighbors. Preparations for that invasion weren't that close to finishing, so military commanders weren't particularly upset by that move. Delaying the invasion of Taiwan would allow the Chinese naval and air forces the time to strengthen themselves more than they were, which was important because they weren't too strong to begin with at this time. Down in Indochina, the People's Republic sent a contingent of military advisors along with a good amount of military aid, mostly smaller weapons and food, but also some artillery pieces that made their way to Ho Chi Minh's forces. Mao considered the Southeast Asian fight against the French one part of the global fight against imperialism, of which Korea was just the next chapter. That's why on July 7th, Zhou Enlai convened a working group of military and political leaders and formed the Northeast Border Defense Army. The NEBDA, which I'll just refer to as NEBDA, incorporated 4 Army Corps, the 38th, 39th, 40th, and 42nd, with 3 infantry divisions apiece, and 3 artillery divisions separately, the 1st, 2nd, and 8th divisions. Each of these divisions were considered the best units of the People's Liberation Army, and had considerable combat experience from the Civil War. At the top of Nebda, these crack units were commanded by crack officers, with Su Yu named commander and political commissar, Xiao Xingguang named vice commander, Xiao Hua named vice commissar, and Li Zhuqi placed in charge of logistics. These four names don't mean much to us right now, but these men were as experienced as warfighters as they were devout communists. These units moved to the Manchurian side of the Sino-Korean border, 255,000 troops in total before the end of July. Once there, though, it would be some time before they crossed the Yalu. As the war bogged down along the Pusan perimeter, Chinese leaders prepared for the different possibilities of the war. In these early August meetings, Mao and his advisors discussed the possibility of the use of atomic weapons, in which the United States still held the advantage over the communists, the possibility of a North Korean collapse, which looked increasingly likely the longer the war dragged on, and the possibility for North Korean success, which they still believed could happen if a few things broke their way. On the topic of the atom bomb, Mao encouraged his comrades to not be afraid of the atom bomb no matter the likelihood of its usage by the Americans. China could survive whatever the imperialist Americans could throw at it, if it came to that. This was less the Americans won't actually use it, and more we'll beat them before they get the chance type rhetoric coming from Mao. It's at this time, in early August, that Mao sent a telegram to the leadership of Nebda encouraging them to keep trooper morale and preparation high, hinting that Mao wanted Chinese troops in Korea soon. This would not come to pass as August ground on, mostly because military preparations could not be completed fast enough to ensure success. The decision to delay the final date for preparation came after a decent amount of internal debate, with some wanting to enter the war immediately, to strike while the iron's hot, so to say, while others wanted to wait for the United States to commit a really egregious anti-Chinese act. To simply intervene on behalf of the North Koreans while their enemies were so far away from the Manchurian border was politically difficult, even though the United States had lost some moral authority internationally for its blatant use of the United Nations for its own means. This debate was pretty well split in the Standing Committee of the Politburo, though, with the final decision a purely logistical one. The Chinese were to wait until two conditions were met. Their military preparations had to be suitably completed for successful intervention, and the political environment had to be agreeable to an intervention with the primary purpose of protecting Chinese interests in Northeast Asia. Preparations were to continue full steam ahead, with traditional military training augmented with lessons in Korean language and geography, American military tactics, and anti-vehicle tactics, as well as the usual political education. The final date for those military preparations to be completed was set for September 30th, and the constantly changing international political environment would surely provide the Chinese government with many opportunities to strike by then. As August inched closer to September, the Chinese looked worryingly at the concentration of American troops in Japan. If they were to be inserted into the battle around Pusan, they would surely not dally in Japan for any serious amount of time, like they were. That they were hanging around Japan showed that there was some other operation in the works in MacArthur's staff. The PLA General Staff decided that 5 port cities were the likely locations of that operation: Wonsan, Nampo, Kunsan, Hungnam, and Inchon. They decided Inchon was the likeliest location for 6 reasons, as reported by Chen. 1. The UN forces' active defense along the Pusan perimeter often trapped KPA divisions behind enemy lines, keeping more KPA troops in the southeastern corner of the peninsula, away from Inchon. 2. Those 2 divisions in Japan were waiting an awfully long time to get to Korea, and were spending that waiting time training for something. 3. MacArthur had a particular penchant for amphibious operations, and the Chinese were certainly aware of the reputation he built for himself in World War II. 4. Many of the types of ships used in amphibious operations were moving from Western bases in East Asia to Japan. 5. As UN troops held out around Pusan, they built stronger defensive lines, keeping more North Korean soldiers in the area to try to break those defensive lines, keeping them from defending other parts of the peninsula. And 6. Inchon was Seoul's port, and Seoul was the most important city in Korea. This set of observations led the PLA's General Staff to single out Inchon as the likeliest spot of some future amphibious UN operation, Such a landing, when done in conjunction with a breakout operation from the southeast, would cut off the KPA from reinforcements, then crush it against a wall of imperialist soldiers. This raises two questions. One, why did the Chinese not warn the North Koreans of their expectations of invasion? And two, why did the Chinese not intervene at this moment to keep the war's momentum going in favor of the communists? Well, to answer that first question, they did. Mao did, at a meeting with a representative of the KPA. He specifically pointed out Inchon as the likeliest place for an American landing. That representative then relayed Mao's message to Kim, who promptly ignored it. Second, that September 30th deadline was as early as NEBDA could complete preparations. They pretty much hoped that any landing would come after that date so they could intervene in time with a properly prepared army. In the meantime, they continued to keep an eye on how each side conducted their part of the war down in Korea. At the end of August, after it was clear that Mao did not want to make the final decision on intervention until the end of September, 3 NEBDA commanders sent a letter to the Central Military Committee expressing their view that early intervention in support of the KPA was necessary to prevent the collapse of the KPA, in spite of Mao's hesitation. They finished their letter with 3 actionable suggestions as well as one more nebulous one. Their 3 main suggestions were that the CMC request assistance from the Soviet Air Force, that 2 additional Army Corps were needed for successful intervention, and that further logistical support was needed to ensure the viability of any operation south of the border. Their 4th suggestion dealt more with the political realm. They believed that waiting until, say, UN forces did something crazy, like cross the 38th parallel, would give China a more militarily and politically favorable position for intervention. But who knows if that would happen. As we know, UN forces struck a massive blow at Inchon on September 15th. This took Beijing by surprise. Of course, that the landing was at Inchon was no surprise at all to the Chinese. But that the landing came so quickly, in the middle of September, that was the surprise. NEBDA was still working to get itself ready for intervention and wouldn't be done for 2 more weeks. Now, the Chinese didn't really have a formal plan that the Inchon landing busted open or anything like that, but it definitely made Mao reconsider his preconditions for intervention. Growing internal reticence in the Politburo towards intervention also gave Mao pause, which makes sense considering Mao was not yet the all-powerful icon he would become after the Cultural Revolution. He would need to convince his party colleagues that intervention was not just worthwhile, but necessary. He also had to convince Joseph Stalin that Chinese intervention was a good idea for both of their countries. Stalin's support was especially important considering he was the leader of global communism at this point. Furthermore, the Chinese required more Soviet equipment and air support to increase the chances for success. Surprisingly, even after Inchon, Kim was not super on board with the idea of the Chinese intervening in his war. He was still in denial that the war had turned against him and was therefore hesitant to assent to intervention. Kim also feared that to allow the Chinese to win the war on his behalf would decrease his control over his country and give too much power to the Yan'an faction of North Korean communist leaders. Factional politics, while difficult to find good information on during the war, were certainly still ongoing and very much affected Kim in his day-to-day conduct of the war. After the landings at Inchon and the subsequent collapse of the KPA, though, Kim had no choice but to accept Chinese intervention. It just took him a few days more to realize that. Back in Beijing, Inchon changed the strategic calculus. Now, Chinese troops would not be fighting alongside Korean soldiers as equals. If they intervened, it would be to save North Korea from total collapse, just as the Americans had done in June and July for South Korea. The Chinese would not be able to win the war quickly for their allies, as they would first have to reverse the momentum of the UN forces before striking their final victory. If they tried and failed at that, or failed to try at all, there would be disastrous consequences for the global communist revolution. In what Chen describes as a Chinese version of the domino theory, defeat in Korea would open the door to increased imperialist intervention in China's sphere of influence. Shortly after the landings, Stalin telegrammed Mao asking for an update on the PLA's military preparations. Mao decided to take 2 weeks to respond, just as UN forces looked like they would cross the 38th parallel in the first weeks of October. That betrays Mao's uncertainty about what to do at this junction. He wanted the situation to clarify itself a bit more, to see how bad the collapse might really be, to choose the best moment to intervene. In the meantime, the Soviets agreed to the Chinese request for air support in the case of Chinese ground intervention, allaying a major concern of PLA leadership. At the end of September, 2 North Korean officials, Pak Il-yu and Pak Hun-yong, traveled to China to request Chinese intervention. That Kim himself did not yet travel to Beijing to request intervention, and that a member of the Yan'an faction and a member of the Southern faction felt the need to request intervention without Kim's approval, reveals that Kim was still in denial about the state of the war. Mao's refusal to accept anything less than a personal request from Kim limited those factional rivalries back in Pyongyang somewhat, but they would remain throughout the war nevertheless. Kim overcame his displeasure with requesting direct assistance from the Soviets and Chinese just a few days after Pak and Pak returned from Beijing, when he and Pak Hun-yong sent a co-signed letter to Stalin requesting direct military aid to shore up the rapidly weakening KPA. If that was not acceptable, assistance in forming volunteer units in China was also suggested. Stalin found that second option much better, as he was concerned about direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. On October 1st, Pak flew to Beijing with a letter from Kim formally requesting Chinese intervention in the Korean War. After a series of increasingly larger meetings, first with the Standing Committee of the party's Politburo, then with an enlarged group of Politburo members, the matter of intervention was discussed in concrete terms. At these meetings, Mao made it clear that they would intervene, and the men gathered were to decide just 2 subsidiary questions: the commander of the intervention force and the date of intervention. 3 options were considered for the commander: Lin Biao, Su Yu, and Peng Dewei. Lin was the clear first choice for his vast military experience, but removed himself from consideration due to his declining health. Su was the next clear choice, also for his command experience, but he was hospitalized for health concerns while building up Nebda in Manchuria. Peng Dewei, while the third choice, was still a strong one. A close ally of Mao, Peng was also an experienced commander with an astute political mind, who was one of the founders of the Red Army back in the late 1920s. Peng was selected as the commander for the Chinese intervention on October 2nd. After that was decided, the next question was quickly answered. Chinese troops would cross into Korea on October 15th. Peng had just 2 weeks to finalize the preparations of his new army. Peng accepted his command from Mao on October 5th. The day prior, pessimism towards intervention dominated the Politburo's discussion, with Mao specifically asking for the disadvantages and dangers of intervention. Chen writes in an endnote that all attendees besides Mao expressed at least some reservations about intervention. These reservations can be grouped into 3 main reasons to not intervene. 1. Another war could hamper China's post-Civil War economic recovery. 2. China was still politically weak from the Civil War and its unsettled outcome. And 3. Korea offered many challenges that the PLA might not be able to meet. Mao took these into consideration, and the meeting ended without a decision. The next day, after accepting the command, Peng spoke strongly in favor of intervention, swinging the sentiment of the committee towards Mao's view that intervention was not just preferable, but necessary for the well-being of the nation. The committee confirmed Peng's new role, and the planning for China's direct intervention into the Korean War entered its final stages. On October 8th, Mao signed the order authorizing Chinese troops to intervene in Korea. His order had 6 points: the specific authorization with a statement renaming the Northeast Border Defense Army to the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, the specific armies and divisions in the PVA, the appointment of Peng as commander of the PVA, placing the PVA within the Northeast Military Logistics Region, affirming that each Chinese soldier must respect their Korean comrades, and encouraging the PVA soldiers to fulfill their task with enthusiasm and vigor. The name change from Nebda to the PVA was done to give the Chinese government some plausible deniability. They wanted to directly confront the United States, but they wanted to give themselves the leeway of not actually confronting the United States directly. That word volunteer does a lot of heavy lifting. Make no mistake, these soldiers were volunteers in name only. They were Chinese soldiers in PLA units with PLA weapons, fighting under PLA commanders under orders from Mao himself. The only thing separating them from their comrades elsewhere in the PLA was that they wore KPA uniforms. Painting them as volunteers was just a step taken to try to avoid a formal declaration of war by the United States. A telegram arrived on Kim's desk later that night informing him of Mao's orders. North Korea might just be saved after all. But then, late on October 12th, Mao cabled the PVA's commanders an urgent message to stop his previous order. Peng was recalled from Manchuria to Beijing for another meeting of the Politburo to discuss intervention. This sudden reversal finds its origins in a small but important misunderstanding between Chinese and Soviet leaders. Well, I say misunderstanding, but really it was Stalin backing out of a verbal agreement. Up until the 12th, the Chinese were planning their operation under the assumption that the Soviet Air Force would provide air support for Chinese and North Korean ground troops. At a meeting between Zhou and Lai, Joseph Stalin, and other high-ranking Soviet and Chinese officials, Stalin informed his Chinese colleagues that the Soviet Air Force was not yet ready for air operations over Korea, and would not provide the expected aerial coverage at this time. Stalin was never really on board with any Soviet forces fighting in or over Korea, as he did not want Soviets fighting Americans in any direct capacity besides an advisory one. To say that this apparently sudden turn in Stalin's sentiments should not have surprised the Chinese, though, would be to project what we know now back onto the past, because the Chinese were reassured multiple times before this that they would have Soviet air support in the skies over Korea. At the Politburo meeting on the 13th, it was decided that, although the Soviets would not provide air support in Korea, the Chinese intervention could move ahead because the Soviets promised to make up for their broken promise by providing more war equipment and extending air coverage at least over Manchuria. The momentary shock of Stalin's air cover reversal was overridden by Mao's desire to cement China's place in the international system, the need to protect the global communist revolution, the opportunity to use intervention to fortify domestic support for the communist government, and the general Chinese inclination to protect their sphere of influence in East Asia. Mao wasn't thrilled with what he got out of Stalin, but it would have to do for now. Mao gave the final order to enter Korea on October 14th, with plans set for soldiers of the PVA to establish a defensive line north of the Pyongyang-Wonsan line. They would wait at this line for 6 months, then withdraw if UN forces did not advance towards them. The rapid advance of UN forces north from the 38th parallel gave the matter some urgency. PVA forces edged closer and closer to crossing, with attachés arriving in various Korean border towns to prepare for the arrival of their comrades. But those in Manchuria still had some reservations about the lack of air support. They felt they did not have enough anti-aircraft weapons to protect themselves from the dominant U.S. Air Force. Specifically, Deng Hua and his fellow PVA commanders wanted to wait until the spring of 1951 to initiate operations south of the Yalu, to allow for a further buildup of what they deemed necessary equipment. Peng delivered this reluctant message to Mao, who told him to wait for the final order as he wanted to discuss the matter with Zhou upon the latter's return from Moscow. Zhou returned to Beijing on the 18th and immediately went to Mao to discuss the matter of intervention, hopefully, one last time. Zhou reassured Mao that the Soviets would support them a bit now and more in the future. That reassurance, taken with Mao's concerns about the fall of Pyongyang, pushed Mao to send out the final order at 9 p.m. that night. On October 19th, the 12 infantry divisions and 3 artillery divisions of the People's Volunteer Army crossed the Yalu River into North Korea. The People's Republic of China had officially, semi-officially, entered the Korean War. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with Chinese soldiers marching into battle against the American imperialist scum. Next week, we will discuss, well, what happens next, at the end of October and into November. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you are not on social media, or if you just want to look around, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.